Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Unfortunately, the sad reality is that today's 300 days since October 7th. 300 days, and still well over 100 of our brothers and sisters are being held in captivity. Our soldiers are still on the front line, their lives in danger every single day, every single moment. And the people in Israel are still suffering, as well as Jews around the world. So it'd only be appropriate that we open this evening's presentation with a chapter of Psalms of Tehillim. You have a Tehillim card in front of you on the table. This is chapter 121. Join me in Hebrew or in English, however you feel comfortable. Shir lamales esainai el haharim me'ain yavei ezri. Ezri me'im adinoi oisei shemayim ba'aretz. Al yitein lamoit raglecha, al yanum shemrecha, hinei la yanum v'la yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shemrecha, Adonai tzilcha, al yad yiminecha, yoimam hashemesh le'ekeka v'yireach v'layla. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor es nafshecha, Adonai yishmor tzescha v'yecha mi'ata v'yad olam. So just to start off with something which is somewhat timely, as a few people over the past couple of days have been asking me. This week, the world is a lot better of a place just from the fact that there are two individuals, as we say, have left the chat. All right, Fuad Shukar and Ismail Hania. They're no longer with us. The world is a safer place to a certain extent, a place with a little bit less evil in it. And the question is, should we be celebrating or not? There are those who did celebrate, there are those who haven't celebrated, and those who are on the fence about it. And the question is, what do our sages guide us when it comes to such an issue? So if you open up the book of Proverbs by King Solomon, there's a verse there that says, Binfol oivecha al tismach, which means at the downfall of your enemy, thou shalt not rejoice, which would seem to mean that there is no place for rejoicing. As well, we find that the Talmud tells us that as the Jewish people, after being enslaved for 210 years in a very sadistic fashion by the Egyptians, they finally made it through the sea. And as the sea came crashing down on the Egyptians, the angels started to sing praise to God. And God turns to the angels and says, how dare you sing while my handiwork, the craft of my hand, is being destroyed in the sea? Seemingly based on that, there is no place for joy and celebration at such a time when a life is being taken. And there's good grounds, moral grounds for that, and that is that if we can rejoice when a life is lost, how are we any different than our enemy? And that is, if we don't value every single life to the point that every single individual is created in the image of God, then what differentiates us from our enemies? However, at the same time, the same book of Proverbs has a verse, that at the loss and the destruction of the wicked, there is rejoicing. And at the same time, we know that in synagogues around the world, every single day, we sing a song that the Jewish people sang while the Egyptians were drowning. The angels were told off, but the Jewish people sang the song. They sang praise to God. So all of a sudden, we are supposed to be celebrating. How do we reconcile this contradiction? So there's many different ways of reconciling it. I want to offer two tonight. The first way of reconciling it is, the reason why God told the angels off is because God said to the angels, you did not suffer at the hands of the Egyptians, the Jewish people did. So you, the angels who did not suffer at their hands, have no right to celebrate. But the Jewish people who sadistically and barbarically suffer at the hands of the Egyptians, they had every right to celebrate. That's one idea. The second idea is that the question is, what are we celebrating? Are we celebrating the downfall? Are we celebrating the killing? Or are we celebrating that the world is now a better place? The world now has an ounce less of evil. So we're celebrating something entirely different. We don't lose our humanity when we celebrate a better world. We lose our humanity when we celebrate a killing, even if it is justified and even if it is necessary. But we also have to have that sensitivity, similar to what Golda Meir once said, that we can forgive the Arabs for many things, but never for them forcing our children to kill their children. So with that, there definitely is, the world now is somewhat of a better place. The war is not over, not even close to over. And just because the downfall of these two evil individuals doesn't change that much. But definitely there's some kind of, a little bit of a hug, a little bit of a smile that we feel at this time. So let's jump into the issue of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and what's been going on there. And what's really driving this topic nowadays, obviously, is October 7th. But the reality is that the issues Israel faces today are nothing new. They existed a lot longer before October 7th was even a thought. October 7th only brings out what was so bad. In other words, October 7th, yeah, it was the greatest day of civilians ever lost in the history of the modern state of Israel. It is the most Jews that were murdered in one day since the Holocaust, and it was great atrocities. But at the same time, in front of you, you have over 20 different terror attacks at the hands of our neighbors in the land of Israel to the Jewish people. It didn't just start on October 7th, going back to the 1920s, this was already an issue, and really way before that, but let's just keep it in the, within the past century, we'll keep it to that. That's number one. Number two, you turn the page, you're going to have 9 different wars and several different operations that the Jewish people and the people of Israel had to carry out just for the sake of survival. So there's nothing new to this. And it seems like there's no end in sight to this vicious cycle, which continuously repeats itself. It's quiet for a couple of months, and then it's just vicious violence. And then it's quiet for a couple of months, maybe even a couple of years if we're lucky, and then it's right back to it. And obviously, whatever we're doing until now is not going to bring a decisive victory. Whatever we're doing till now is not going to bring peace and safety, which is what we're after. And if that's the case, what will bring peace and safety? Another idea is that there seems to be this great lack of clarity in the world right now. And that is, for a very long time, anti-Semitism was really on the back burner for most Jews. Thank God, with the Holocaust in the rearview mirror pretty far back, for the most part, Jews in the diaspora felt pretty comfortable. And the notion of anti-Semitism, especially the generation that I grew up in, was almost nothing. Okay, so you got called a name in the park while you were playing basketball or something, but that's as far as anti-Semitism went. And even then, half the time they meant it as a compliment. It wasn't even an insult. But what happened was, when it comes to Israel, so again, over the past 20, 30, 40 years, this was on and off. It brought up a lot of heat in the world. But then finally, when October 7th happened, for many Jews, they thought, finally, the world will see it for what it is. The world will be able to distinguish between good and evil. And they'll have that clarity that we are in the right, they are in the wrong. Who is good and who is evil? They'll finally realize how barbaric these people are and how evil and twisted they truly are. That lasted maybe 24, if you're lucky, 48 hours. In the beginning, it looked that way. But then all of a sudden, within the same week, they were already denying the story, while at the same time playing the same videos. They were boasting about it while denying it, and go figure. And the world just sucked that up, and the world accepted it. And we stand here today, 300 days later, and the world seems to have completely lost its moral compass. And anti-Semitism is on the rise everywhere. So what can we do about all this? And how are we supposed to approach this? So tonight's presentation is not going to discuss any political issues. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of different scenarios and situations. We'll leave that for later for unpacking, or the rest of our lives to nitpick at everything. And what we're not going to do is, this isn't just going to be another, right-wing or left-wing radio talk show of some kind of political issue. But what we're going to do is we're going to delve into Torah values that have been around for over 3,000 years, God-given values, and see how can they direct us and give us guidance for the general picture and as fundamental ideas to guide us through these murky waters. That's number one. Number two, we're going to do it uniquely through the lens of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And through the lens of many of his talks. It's going to be a unique presentation tonight, how we will be watching several video clips throughout the evening. As we bring out each idea, we'll see how the Rebbe spoke about it. And what's fascinating is everything the Rebbe said had to have been said over 30 years ago. The Rebbe passed away 30 years ago. So we're talking about talks the Rebbe gave 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, even some of them 60 years ago. But you'll see, as we watch them, It's as if the Rebbe was sitting in this room talking today exactly about the situation that we are dealing with. And with that, we'll turn to the first video.
הרב ביקש לשמוע מה דעתי על המצב. הוא לא שאל אותי מה עושה השירות, במה מתמחה השירות. הייתה לי מיד איזושהי תחושה או הרגשה שהוא בדיוק יודע במה מדובר. כלומר, הוא לא זקוק לאיזשהם הסברים שלי או איזושהי מצגת שלי על מה, אלא מעניין אותו פחות או יותר אותם עניינים שבתוכן, אותם עניינים שבפנים, שבהם שירות הביטחון עוסק, וסיפרתי לו. סיפרתי לו את הדאגות שלי, את ההטרדות שלי בנושא הפלסטיני. כאשר אני סקרתי בפניו את הנושא של האינתיפאדה, אני התייחסתי יותר לאירועים המעשיים שקורים בשטח, ואת הניתוח שלי, של השירות, למה זה קרה, וכיצד אנחנו חושבים אפשר לטפל בזה. כאשר הרבי ניתח, הוא דיבר על כך שמדובר כאן בסכסוך שלא ייפטר, לא על ידי הפגנה כזאת או אבן כזאת, או תוכנית טלוויזיה כזאת או אחרת. אני דיברתי בצורה הרבה יותר, הייתי אומר, קצרה, מעשית, הייתי אומר אפילו יותר שטחית. הרבי כמובן דיבר לעומק. הוא ניסה לנתח את השורשים, ניסה להבין יחד איתי, אם אלה השורשים, מהו הפתרון, מהי התרופה. הבקיאות של הרבי גם בעניינים שאינם עניינים דתיים. במצב הבינלאומי, במצב הטרור, ולא רק במצב העם היהודי, מה שנקרא, מה שנעשה אצל הגויים, מה שנעשה אצל השכנים, הייתה מרשימה מדהימה גם בהיקפים שלה, גם ביכולת הניתוח.
על פי הידיד שיש לי מוושינגטון, אשר שום מסרגזים, הידיוס מכל פינס אוהלו, המטר הוא חמור.
הרבי בכל הנושאים שלו התייחס יותר לשורשים. את הנצחיות, של שותפות הגורל. נצח ישראל לא ישקר.
Der Rebischter hat gegeben, Eretz Yisrael zu ihnen, ist das ein Nachlass selber.
בעצם הצורה שבה מנתחים ומנתח את הדברים, בעצם הצורה שהוא אומר אותם, ובעצם התשובות שלו או ההתייחסויות שלו לנושאים שהועלו בשיחה בינינו, אני מבין גם מה הוא חושב כיצד צריך לנהוג.
ידעתי auch also בהקל שצריך לבטל בלי משהו על המיליון ג'ביים, ובשביל זה יקבלו משהו, וזה ההפך של הטבע של אנטיסמיטיזם. אנטיסמיטיזם נסקיימה, נסייזמה, נסקיימה, על ידי זה שומדו חזק, שמשהו חיוני בשבילו, אי אפשר בזה לבטל.
אני זוכר שבדרך במכונית למלון חזרה לניו יורק, עצמתי כך את העיניים וניסיתי לשחזר את השאלות ואת הניתוחים, כמה אני צריך להתעלות מעל המצוקות היומיומיות וההשתלבטויות היומיומיות שהן קיימות למכביר.
Aber lechele rei bewohnt in Joni von Pikuach Nefesh, bewohnt in Joni von Gejanke, bewohnt in Joni von Kiddush Hashem והפוכת. macht mich es beines, wo es allein besser von der Maflege.
ההתייחסויות של הרבי יעמדו לעולם ועד. מכיוון שהרבי לא אמר, או לא התייחס לאיזושהי תקופה שתסתיים ב. הרבי התייחס לנושא העקרוני, להתפתחות, לתהליכים. והם נכונים היו אז, הם נכונים היום, ואם אתה שואל את דעתי או עניות דעתי, הם יהיו לעולם ועד. היא עדכנית לרגע זה, כמו שהיא הייתה מבחינתי ברגע הראשון, כאשר ישבתי איתו בתחילת שנות ה-90. בסופו של דבר, חלק גדול מהם התקיים, ומה שלא התקיים עוד יתקיים, בצורה כזאת או בצורה אחרת, כמובן, תחת מאפיינים ותחת רקעים שונים ומשונים. אבל אין ספק שהדברים הם ללא ספק אפליקטיביים גם לימינו אלה.
All right, so we're going to do just that, what he said. We're going to start from the bottom. We're going to talk about some of them ideas might seem pretty basic and fundamental, but really fundamental. And just like a building, you need to have a strong and clear foundation in order to strengthen the entire structure. That's what we're going to do. So let's take it really back from its first point, and that is, what is our relationship with the land of Israel? And what I mean by that is as follows. The rhetoric and the arguments nowadays in the streets, nowadays on the news, social media, wherever you look, is basically Israel, the Jewish people, are a bunch of thieves, a bunch of occupiers, and a bunch of colonizers. So what's the response that's going around? Okay, so let's go with, the classic agreement of international law. And that is either going to be quoting the Balfour Declaration or the UN agreement. And based on that, seemingly we're not occupiers, we're not thieves, and we're not colonizers. The problem with that is that who gave Balfour the right to declare, who gave the UN the right to declare whose land it is, whose land it isn't? So it really doesn't answer any of these questions. That's number one. Number two, we're sitting here because of these arguments. The reason why in 2024 we're still arguing about it is because this is what we've been screaming back and forth. So what do they already do for us? Okay. So others want to go to the Holocaust issue, and that is the Jewish people need a homeland after the Holocaust. But that still doesn't justify being a colonizer, a thief, or an occupier. That still doesn't justify any of the above said arguments. And if that's the case, what value is there in that argument? So last week, a lot of people got very excited because Bibi Netanyahu gave a very powerful and a great speech in Washington. And he said, as he quotes, "You're going to call us colonizers? This is the land where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob walked. This is the land where King David, King Solomon, King Saul ruled. The streets in which Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah prophesied, and you're going to call us the colonizers?" Yeah. And now what? Everybody got very excited from his statement, but he missed the point. And the only real argument that stands is this and this only. God is the one who gave it to us. God gave us this land. This is the promised land given to us by God. All the other arguments have gotten us here. They've gotten us this far. They've gotten us into all of these arguments and these fights. That is the only answer that has no rebuttal. Now, these are not my words. This is the idea that the Rebbe would champion all the time, but it's based on the first Rashi, the first commentary from Rashi, the great French commentator from the 12th century on the Chumash, on the Bible, where he opens up, he says, if the book of the Torah, the Bible, is supposed to be a book of instructions, so why do we have the entire book of Genesis? We should have skipped the entire book of Genesis, which is basically the recount of creation, the first 2,500 years of existence. Should have jumped straight into the story of the first commandment that God gave the Jewish people while in Egypt. Because if it's all about the commandments anyways, why bother with the stories? Why bother with the history? And Rashi, he's saying this, he's writing this in the 1100s. He quotes a sage who lived almost 1,000 years before him, a sage who lived in the 2nd or 3rd century. And he says that really the Torah did not need to start from the beginning of Genesis. And the only reason why the Torah started with that is because one day the nations of the world will come along to the Jewish people and say, "You are thieves. What are you doing in the land of Israel?" And the only answer that's going to help is because God created the world. And that's why the Bible starts off with the story of creation. And God is the one who promised it to Abraham, has promised it to his descendants, and God is the one who gave us the land. There are no other arguments that can stand against that. Now, what's fascinating is you have to realize Rashi was saying this in the 12th century. This is before CNN. This is before social media, and this is before anybody else is spewing these lies. Rashi was living in France at the time, the south of France. He wasn't even thinking in his wildest dreams of moving to the land of Israel because it seemed impossible then. And this was a truth that stood beyond and for itself. But let's see how the way that the Rebbe puts it.
Hebt so raschen sagt Bereiche der Ronexin, am soll wissen sein Psag din Betere, am sagt on der Chatchile, as it sein as am in Zeit. Und nicht mit Sorgen Golui, am will etwas zunehmen, will etwas tun an Navle, sie teilen seiner verkehrt mit rechtfertigen Menschen, mit Anoshim Tzadikim, jogt sich nach Scholem, man will darf gescholem. Aber wie bald man darf scholem, darf sich sein verbunden auf Niton an Navle des Zweiten, hat doch ein Gasloni Matte. Wo das sieht man bepasst. Darf sehen, als soll sich nicht stellen gegen den Rotzen Abele, was bir Zähne in Nosno Lohe und bir Zähne in Notla Mehev in Noslo, zu Libnei soll am Gedesche in der Neven von Achla Seele. Und wenn ist mir nichts mehr schlicht mit dem Menschen, wenn Menschen nicht. Am hebt zu reden mit anderen Unionen. Okay, du mit Duber kam Pomme. Am setzt sich Adover Nifla, alle Teile Schönes und Schönes, was man gekonnt hat und was nicht in Gänze. Und das ist der einzige Teil, was bis sich stemmt, sich zu sagen.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, I'm willing to go along with this spiel, which means I believe in the Torah, I believe in the Bible, and I believe that it's our heritage, it's our inheritance from God. God gave it to us. But is this really the answer that is going to work at the protest with somebody screaming or waving a sign that says Free Palestine? Is that really an answer that they're going to accept? Is that really an answer that I can post on social media and not get backlash for it? And the answer is two. Number one, well, how good are the other answers working? Have you tried this one? Has anybody gotten up there and actually tried this one? Actually, one person was the pastor at the rally in DC was the only one who got up and said that. Nobody else was willing to get up and say that. That's number one. Number two, this answer is less about them and it's more about us. And that is let's take a moment and stop looking at the world for validation and justification. Start looking inside and justify and validate yourself and come from there, come from a place of strength that I don't need everybody else to agree with me. And this can still be the reality. Because if this is what it says in 5 books of Moses, this is what God said to Abraham, God said to our ancestors, this is what is. Who do you believe in, them or God? And let's start with that at least. And as the Rebbe once wrote in a letter to the president of Israel in the 60s and early 70s, Zalman Shazar. And the Rebbe writes him as follows: I am not under the delusion that arguments based on principles of justice and integrity will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. But a most important factor is the morale of the youth, including within the IDF and the students in the United States and elsewhere. In other words, this answer has to be something which we are willing to believe and we are willing to give over to our children and to the youth of our generation, that they should believe this. They should hold this within their heart, because the moment that they let go of this, that's when corrosion happens. That's when the other arguments break down the walls and we start trying to come up with sophisticated answers that fall flat on their face and end us up in the situation that we are in today. Okay, based on that idea, so we've established our connection to the land. Let's jump to the next segment, and that's going to be, what are our responsibilities in regards to safety and security? And that is as follows. We know that in Judaism, I guess the number one most important thing in Judaism is preserving a human life, to the point that we suspend every single commandment in the Torah, every single concept in the Torah, in order to save a life. Now, granted, there are 3 scenarios where we're not getting into those technicalities right now, but for the overall picture, and that's why, if it's Shabbat and we don't do any work on Shabbat, but somebody's life is in danger, not only is it permitted to desecrate the Shabbat, it's actually obligated to desecrate the Shabbat in order to save someone's life. Now, based on that idea, that means when it comes to saving lives, that is the highest priority. That trumps and takes over any other priorities that we think we have. They all get aside for the sake of saving a life. Now, based on this idea, the Talmud shares with us an interesting idea, and that within the world of saving lives, there are two elements, and that is, one is called the roidev, which is known as the pursuer, and that is the classic law of the Talmud based on biblical scripture, and that is, if one person, person A, is pursuing as an act of murder to another person, so then anybody has the right to stop the attacker. And if the only way you can stop the attacker is by taking their life, one is not only allowed to, but one is obligated. If we can stop the attacker in a different form or another, then we're obligated to use those other methods. That's rule number one the Talmud gives. But then the Talmud takes it to the next level, and that is habala hargacha hashkim laharge, which means if it's clear to you that your enemy or the attacker has intention to kill, even before they actually stepped into the act, but they have intention to kill, you have an obligation to do a preventative attack. You can't sit there and wait, say, you know, let me wait till they fire the first bullet. Let me wait till they throw the first grenade or launch the first rocket. No, the Torah says you're obligated with a preemptive attack if it's clear to you that they have intentions of murder. Okay, based on that, let's use these values and these fundamental ideas, and let's go into history a little bit. And that is, in the modern state of Israel, was there ever a war that Israel began with a preemptive attack? Very good. One war, and that was the Six-Day War in 1967. And it's amazing. In less than a week, the results were staggering. Overwhelming victory for Israel over its neighbors that, according to every rhyme and reason, Israel should have been wiped out by them. And these neighbors were ready to wipe us out completely off the map, performing another Holocaust. With this preemptive attack, not only did they thwart the attack, but they actually were decisively victorious. And it's hard to think of another war in history since the state of Israel was established that there was such a decisive victory. And that is based on the value. If one is coming to kill you, you rise up to kill them first. And that's what we follow. But there is one other time where Israel did a preemptive attack, and that was the attack on the nuclear reactor in 1981. But that didn't develop into a full-blown war, but that itself also saved countless lives just from that attack itself. Now, let's contrast this for a moment with the war, or several wars, as we just said, but with a specific war, a famous war, where they didn't go with a preemptive attack, and that was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Now, the Yom Kippur War in 1973 was a horrible debacle, and that was, we know that they had intelligence of the war coming. The morning of Yom Kippur, 4 a.m., October 6, 1973, 4 a.m., Golda Meir's phone rang, and basically she got word that the war was coming, an attack was coming. Not only did they not start off with a preemptive attack, they were told that afternoon. Not only did they not go with a preemptive attack, they didn't even call up the reserves. Not only that, it gets worse. There is a record that on September 25th, 1973, the king of Jordan, Hussein, actually met with the Mossad and told them that a war is coming. And he told them roughly around when. And Israel sat back and did nothing. Now, it wasn't just Israel's fault. America was also had a big hand in that, telling them, do not do anything, do not attack in any way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, over 2,500 lives were lost. Forget about how many were actually injured. Right there you have it, the difference between the preemptive attack, following the Torah's rule of Habala Hargahash Harga. If their enemy is there to kill you, you attack first. Don't wait for them to attack. They have ill intentions, evil intentions. Don't wait. We see what happens historically. And when we do follow the Torah's law, and we do go ahead with that attack, What we have is, or sorry, when we don't do with that, the results of the Yom Kippur War was a long-lasting national trauma of what happened, and it negated their entire victory of the Six-Day War. They lost the ego that was created in that, or not the ego, but the pride that they had from the Six-Day War was completely lost in 1973. The loss of international respect, because now Israel's no longer a nation that you need to be worried to attack. You can attack and they won't be ready. You can attack and there won't be any retribution. You can get away with it. And there's actually till today in Cairo, there's a museum called the 6th of October Panorama, where they have blown out Israeli tanks and the likes, where they bring school children there to say, look, this was the victory that we had over Israel, to try to build them up, not just to hate Israel, but to also look down on Israel. Look, we were victorious over them. And these are the results when we don't act first. When we have that intelligence and we're able to do something about it, we must rise up. Now, some will argue, but there was something positive that came out of it, and that was, as Israel was losing the war, America came to their aid. And America came to their aid with some pretty powerful weapons, delivering them to the Israelis, which actually gave them the ability to survive the war and come to some kind of end of that war. But this argument completely misses the point. And let's see how the Rebbe puts it.
Wie kommt es, hat nicht gefolgt dem Mumchen bin Jonah Milchoma, hat mir gefunden eine Berechtigung. Aber Schaas hat gesehen, hat gebracht auf 9. Tag, auf 8. Tag, Neschek von Nazis Abris, hat man sich damals gefreut, als 7 wollte 10 nie gefolgt, und es wollte gewähren an Milchemes Manna, wollten sie nie geschickt dem Neschek auf 9. Tag. Was in der ganze Hatzdoke fällt der Rike, als wohl gewähren am Milchemes Manna, wollte nie gedacht haben am Milchome bemäßig von 9 Tag. Na, wie sie gewähren in der 6-Tagige, als die gerufene 6-Tagige Milchome, es wohl gewähren als Sach früher bei Nizochen Gomor, was auf Drufi gewähren genug der Neschek, was man gehabt, umgegräht in der Machsane mit den verschiedenen Äften, in Eretz HaKedesh, befragt noch hier die Milchemes Manna, wohl gewähren mit der Schof früher, worum kaum hat nicht nur gewusst, Bichlal, als mit Gräßig in der Milchemes Astkofo, mod gehad a Idee Brüder, und mit kam es dort in Wendes wird sich anheben, und mod gehad die volle Möglichkeit, auf hoben dem Gius und hoben dem Milchemes Manna, die Präventiv war, kam es schon es lief nicht sehr, wo demut wollte sich das geendigt noch Mistam alpi derech Hateva, ebenso die Milchemes 6 Jahre gewähren mit derech Hateva. A Sach Kitzer, wie in 6 Tagen, und es wollte geöffnet geendigt, Korom und Leil in Anefen, als wohl gewähren genug dem Neschek, was man gehad, genug angesammelt, man hat nicht gedacht, umkommen zu Neschek Neser.
So what we have from this so far is the number one principle in Judaism is preservation of life. And therefore, the result of that has to be, if there is a clear threat, we must act first, not wait. And that preserve lives. Now, I want to make 2 points of clarification on that. And that is, number one, this has nothing to do with the land of Israel. This Torah rule and this Torah law is really a law that exists in all times and in all places. It has nothing to do with the land of Israel. It applies in America, it applies in Mexico, it applies in Antarctica if you're living there. And that is, human life is the most important thing. And that's why this idea of act first is not just to save more Jewish lives, as we're going to see in a moment. The Rebbe points out this also means saving more lives for our enemies. Because if our enemies are scared to attack, that also means less casualties on their side. So it's not just about preserving only our lives, but it's preserving life entirely of those around us, both of our friends and even of our enemies.
Schaas me weiß, als do einer, was bolle Horgo, ist demot nie der Sede. Am darf sitzen und warten, bis wann nicht alle Goyim und Masken sei. und mit Pasken in dem Dien in einer Asife von 119 Members von Goy. Also der Goy wird am soll ihm schmeißen und unter dem wird machen eine Asife von dem Minyaniden. Als seine Nechet Maske mit den 119 Goyim, nicht, dass der Seder hat mit dem, was hat, was wolle Horde. Früher bringt dem Dien in Belgien, in die UN, und dort sich zusammenbleiben, die alle Anoschen Tzadikim wie Schori. Mose wollen das tun, Nordre wollen sein, bemocken, in dem Pläne, was haben dort mit Spaller gewinnt, zu dem und dem, was dort ungesagt war, zu Rache Komecho, mal die geben Apachen in Backe zu stellen, die zweite Back, und danach wollen sie aufpassen, wie der Ding von dem, was dort geschossen. Und danach wirst du Micho sein uns dem Folgen. Sagt die Tere, nein, nicht, dass sie der Seder. Nicht nur, dass sie nicht der Seder verlieren. Dem Goy macht das keine. Aber der Goy weiß, als Bolle Order. Und du schickst da rein ein Papier, sich einer, den ich gesagt. Als wie du willst, gehen schlagen an jeden. Soll sie wissen sein, dass das ein gegen dem Charter. Und da sagt mir, kann wo jede Pschimme nehmen, sucht in jeder Sache Atam, ich darf gar nicht ankommen, zu Achukachakakti gesehen und gesagt. Sie bolle Orga, was mit dem nicht was zu tun. Der erste sagt, dafür sehen, Haschkim le Orga. Steht gar nicht Haschkim le Orga, steht da, dafür Magen im Befehl. Sieht nicht kommen dazu. Also hat nur sehen, eine Fartor, und schickt nicht kein Brille. Nur du bist umgestanden Almenas, als Ebert sich prüfen, Tage le Orge. Ich sag, demol bist du mochen, Haschkim le Orge, wird hat viele nicht gehen zu dir.
As the Rebbe points out, it says Hashkim laharge, which means not arise and kill them. Arise to kill, which means you may not even have to kill. All you need to do is show might, show power that you're ready and willing to do whatever it takes to protect your own lives. You're going to save lives on both sides. And by the way, within this rule would also include targeted hits. And it shouldn't have to take a bomb falling on 12 children playing soccer for a targeted hit to be put into play when they could have done that before. Okay. If that's the case, and we laid down, I think, the parameters of our responsibility towards safety and security, at what point, right? So we can initiate now. We know when to initiate. So either as a defense or in the case where there's a clear threat, where our enemy wants to kill us. And by the way, if anybody wants to know if our enemy wants to kill us, yes, and they'll tell it to you themselves. They're not even hiding it anymore. But at what point? That's also true. But at what point does it stop? All right, ceasefire now. Does anybody want a ceasefire? You don't need to answer that question. So at what point does it stop? What does the Torah tell us? And as we're going to see in a moment, the Torah tells us very clearly, you do not stop until the job is done. Regardless of what the world is going to say, you continue until the job is finished. Regardless of political sensitivities, you go until the job is finished. You don't take anybody's security assurances, you don't take anybody's guarantees or promises, not from friend or foe. You go until the job is done. Until then, you do not stop. And on the contrary, to stop would actually be immoral. As we'll see in a moment, it's the words from the Rebbe during the 1982 Lebanon War.
Als du bist als Rachmon al-Islam darf machen an die Tour. Danach bringt mir nach rein, nach Isha, Jore, Verachalivo. Und sagt, als sie vergisst sich die ersten 3 Tropfen Blut, hebt sich am Betten. Ist seit Mafsig. Ist doch angehend schneiden, angehend dem Nitur. Seit ist Mafsig, soll sich der Patient erholen und werden zurück, kommen zu seiner Kirche, dann wird machen den zweiten Nitur. Danach der zweite Nitur, Tornen echt nicht machen wie Basachas. Sie gießt sich Blut, ist das Lero von dem Patient, darf machen dem Nitur, in die Stolnes, wenn wir das so. Bischaß Emischer wollte sich erlebt, sagen, als Sach, dann geht zu Bries, Aguf, Gepschute, wenn geht zu Bakterien, versteht man sich, was man mit ihm getan und wie man wollte ihm gefolgt. Hat man getan, hat die Sache mit 3 Millionen Jiden gegeben. Gemacht an die Tour, noch hat man gebracht, Aisha Jore, noch alle wohl, hat geheißen, Mafsig sein, hat nämlich gewollt folgen und geht nach einer Schiffe, hat gesagt, es ist nicht demokratisch, und man darf fragen bei Zweiten, und also kann fragen in Deutschland. Und danach gewesen weiterer See und wieder See, hat gemacht, der Zweiten nicht durch Übergehase dieselbe Sache. Der Dritten nicht durch Übergehase dieselbe Sache. Wie ist dort der Vierte nicht durch, was man schon ihm getan? Und man hat schon gebracht, Korbonis, weil Hashem hinten dumm. Hunderte Menschen mit hunderten Psuien und nicht es fällt einem an Einfall, zu zwei, zu drei, zu vier, als Gedei, der Matze soll bringen zu der Schule. Wie kann jese Basei, was dazu diese losen den Wund, als sie soll sein mit allen Bakterien, mit allen Sachen, nur dann Leponin werden die Bakterien rüberlegen von einem Nortina zweiten.
As the verse says in Deuteronomy chapter 20, when you besiege a city for many days to wage war against it, to capture it, besiege the city that makes war with you until its submission. Or as it says in Hebrew, ad ridita, you don't stop. Not at any point, you go until the end. To stop at any point would completely defeat the purpose of even starting in the first place, and would end up backfiring, as the example that the Rebbe gave with his surgery. And it's fascinating how during the Yom Kippur, right, in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, the Rebbe did bring this up, as we'll see in a minute. And the Rebbe said they should have gone all the way to Cairo and Damascus. They shouldn't have stopped. The Rebbe said himself.
The Israelis began advancing in all fronts, and they arrived at more or less 40 kilometers from Damascus. It was already the 5th day of the war. I get a call from Benjamin Klein. The Rebbe said, go and ask Dayan to enter Damascus.
בשמחת תורה, אני ושלמה לוין, הקונסול, ניסינו להסביר לרבי שמשה דיין פוחד מהתערבות רוסית לטובתם של הערבים, ואז מצבנו יהיה רע מאוד, לא בטוח מה יעשו האמריקאים. הרבי אמר לו, אין טעם, אין היגיון בתפיסה הזאת. הוא אומר שהרוסים סתם מאיימים, לא צריך לחשוש מהרוסים. האמריקאים מעוניינים שאנחנו ננצח את הסורים, הם רק לא אומרים לנו את זה. והרבי ביקש מאיתנו, בתום שיחה ארוכה מאוד, שנחזור עוד באותו ערב, ונטלפן כל אחד למי שהוא מכיר, הוא יכול לטלפן, לראש הממשלה, או לשר הביטחון, או למישהו אחר מראשי השלטון בישראל, תגידו בשמי שישראל צריכה לסיים את מלחמת יום הכיפורים בכיבושה של דמשק.
Dayan took it very seriously. He said to me, I cannot do it from a manpower point of view. I called back Benjamin, and then the Rebbe was on the line. The Rebbe's answer was, it's a big mistake. It's a big mistake. That all.
הוא אמר לי, תשמע, מלחמת יום כיפור, תוצאות לא טובות. אומר, רבי, תראה, מבחינה צבאית, אנחנו הגענו ל-101 קילומטר מהבירה המצרית. אנחנו הגענו ל-40 קילומטר מהבירה הסורית. הוא אומר, לא. מנצחים, הרבי אומר, זה שכובשים את הבירות. אמרתי, כן, אבל היו בעיות לוגיסטיות. הוא אומר, מה שרון סיפר שאין לו דלק? הוא היה צריך להשתמש בדלק שהמצרים הכינו בשבילם. על המצרים, אומר הרבי, תכננו התקפה, כלומר, לאורך הדרכים והנתיבים, בטוח שהיה לה מצבורי דלק. ולמה לא השתמשו בדלק הזה ולהגיע לבירות?
Now, pretty wild, pretty provocative. But the idea that the Rebbe was saying that they should go all the way to Cairo and all the way to Damascus wasn't so that they should take over. The Rebbe said they should go for 24 hours just to show, number one, the Egyptian and the Syrian army that they could, and number two, to show the civilians as well. Because absolute surrender, absolute victory means the army and the civilian population understand we mean business and we have the capacities and capabilities. And then leave. Go back home and let them be.
Cannot lie afterwards. They say, "Oh no, we beat him."
Exactly. And that's it. There's no two ways about it. You want to take a look at World War I and World War II. What happened? World War I ended in a truce. There were never, the Allies were victorious over the Germans. The Germans said no. Give them a couple of months and they start to spin the story. It was the Jews who betrayed us. And slowly but surely, the Jews go to World War I. And that led directly to the start of World War II. The Allies, the Allied powers were a little smarter with World War II, and they came to the conclusion, and they agreed that they needed to conquer and march through Berlin, even if the Germans would concede defeat, because it wouldn't be over until it was an absolute victory, and everybody saw a clear, decisive victory. And when we do that, we accomplish two things. Number one, we bring hostilities to a speedier conclusion, because when you're looking for an absolute defeat, it's a lot quicker. Then, okay, let's just push back a little and see what happens next. Number two, we save lives on both sides of the conflict. There's less war to be fought in this particular war, and there's going to be less war the next time because they're a lot less likely to even think about attacking again if they saw what happened last time. The Rebbe writes in a letter in 1982 in the summer during the Lebanon War. And this was, sorry, not a letter, and this is the conclusion of a public address of a Farbrengen that the Rebbe gave that year. In order to expedite God's protection over every Jewish person, I will give each and every one of you a dollar bill, as we have done many times in the past, to give to charity, along with an addition of your own. Give this to charity for your own merit, for the merit of all the Jews, and especially for the merit of the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces, that they may succeed in finishing the operation with minimal losses, or better yet, no losses at all. Swiftly completing the operation will also prevent unnecessary enemy casualties. They too are human beings created in the image of God, and it is the duty of the Jew to also care for the lives of each and every non-Jew. These are the words of the Rebbe. A decisive victory, and you're going to end up saving lives on both sides. Now, based on that, we know when the war has to start with a preemptive attack. We know that our responsibilities are to protect every single life, and therefore a decisive victory to the end. We don't stop in middle. There's something else interesting that the Torah gives us a very unique position on, and that is in regarding security. The strategic framework of defense and deterrence is something interesting, how to respond to which threats. Now, to which threats do we have to take seriously or a little bit extra serious? So in the code of Jewish law, it says as follows. This is in the laws of Shabbat. Generally, just like on Shabbat, we don't do work. We also are not meant to go to war on Shabbat. That's also a type of work. Now, it reads as follows. If non-Jews besiege Jewish cities, so this has nothing to do with Israel, this is even if the Jews are living in the diaspora. If non-Jews besiege Jewish cities, if they're monetary, we do not desecrate the Shabbat to protect ourselves. It means we give them whatever they came looking for. They want money, you give it to them and you let them move on. We don't desecrate the Shabbat just to save a few bucks. But if they came to kill, or with no presented reason, we go out with weapons and desecrate the Shabbat to battle with them, because if there's no presented reason, you can assume that they're there to take lives. However, in a city near the border, even if they just came to plunder straw or hay, which means nothing, we initiate a military offensive, even if this entails desecrating the Shabbat. And this is the reason, so far, based on these two ideas, based on this value, why the IDF operates on Shabbat. But what's happening here, what is unique about the border city? Which means the first part of the clause, the first clause of the law is pretty straightforward. If they're not here to take lives, we don't desecrate Shabbat. Give them what they ask for and move on with it. We'll have to figure out the money another way. So the same reason why a Jew will walk away from a business deal that's sitting on the table if it means desecrating Shabbat. So just like we're willing to walk away from a business deal, we're not going to protect our assets. But when it comes to protecting lives, we will. But what is it that the border city has unique about it that no matter what they're coming for, even if they're just there for hay and straw, all they want is some provisions, but they're willing to take it by force, that we must go out and desecrate the Shabbat and wage war against them. What's happening? So one of the commentaries of the laws of Shabbat from the 12th century, living in Vienna, his name is Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe, known as the Marzu, and he says as follows: Jewish law views a city alongside the border differently, for fear that if the enemy conquers it, it'll be a launching pad that will allow them to conquer the entire land with greater ease. Let that sit in for him. Let that register for a moment. And that is, losing a strategic position is a lead up to a life and death situation, and therefore we desecrate the Shabbat. And if you want to look at this in the context of Israel, this is 100% a reality, and that is, we know that when it comes to wars of our friendly neighbors, those around Israel, there's no such thing as a second chance. There's no such thing as losing a war. Losing a war means they're going to wipe us out. And if you're not sure, ask them and they will tell you. Right? From the river to the sea. That's number one. Number two, losing a strategic city on the border means losing time. Israel's not that wide. Israel's not that big. To get from one place in Israel to another doesn't take that long. Traffic, yes. But if not for traffic, it's very small. It's extremely small. Losing a city on the border can mean the difference of a few miles, which is pretty much all the time you have to respond to anything. And that's because Israel has no real defensive depth. You see, when cities go to war, when countries go to war, there's something called the defensive depth, and that is that we know that we can back up several miles or even more than that, and we're not putting the rest of our country in danger. In Israel, if they back up an inch, the entire country is already in danger. So to give up a strategic position on the border is suicide. And you see this all the time, and October 7th is the greatest proof of that. We don't need any more proof than that. In addition to the fact that Israel is fighting a war, besides the conventional war, they're also fighting the war of rockets falling on their heads every day. And that means every inch that the enemy gets brings them an inch, a foot, or a mile closer, which means now the rockets have more range of where to go. In addition to the fact that they're also fighting war within, we call it the terrorist attacks. And if that's the case, what we can take from this clear law is you never, ever cede any control over a strategic position. Now, the military minds in Israel have known this since its inception. And that's why in the Milchemet HaShachor, in the War of Independence, most of their strategic planning was how to capture certain areas that would lead to some kind of stability or some kind of security, because they understood this very well. However, unfortunately, throughout our history, they didn't keep to that. And time again, the Rebbe would scream, the Rebbe would talk, and you see that the Rebbe would talk for 40, 50 years. For 40 years, the Rebbe spoke. And with such passion, and you can feel the pain in the Rebbe's heart. Just this idea, do not give up position. Torah law, Torah values do not allow you to do that. You're putting yourselves in danger with every inch of land that they gave away. They're putting themselves in even more danger. And that's why, even when the enemy is coming with just the claim, we're here for straw and hay. We're not here to take lives. We're not here to bother anybody. We have no interest in ruling your country. What does the Torah law or Torah value say? Absolutely not. Turn away, or we're coming out with guns blazing. And that has to be the response.
In der Rotzen von der Meibischen, aber Schaße kommen zu gehen nicht hin und sagen, als sie will nehmen, zunehmen bei jedem Teven wie Kasch, bei jedem, was leben in Chutzloretz, und sie rät sich wegen Aschettig in Chutzloretz, und sie rät sich wegen Teven wie Kasch. In der Breite der Even Habechen, kdei wissen, was mir darf tun, steht in Shulchan Aruch Dvorim Brurim. Aber mir darf nicht kommen zu Chochmas Bosser Vadam. Und mir darf nicht kommen zu seinen Pschäppler. Und mir darf nicht kommen zu seinen Svoris, worin der Rebester hat Tiber gegeben hat, zu Anoshim, Smuchim, Mish mit Peish von Moshe Rabbeinu, was Mesore Lishu und dann noch der Achardei, bis zu dem Beis Yosef und dem Ramoi Shulchan Aruch, und sie haben gesagt, dass sie kein Afgeminen nicht, was sie mit bet und was mit bet. Eifs ist ach Schasch, als die Posach Horetz Lifnehem, darf man sich stellen mit Neshek, a viele Bishabos, und a viele, als mehr nicht, wie man Machmischen und Boi. Der Tam ist auf zu bewohrnen, scheleit die Posach Horetz Lifnehem. Und befragt nach, hat dort gar nicht gedacht, umkommen. Motlich hat viele gesagt, dass einer hat gesagt, dass darf haben Teven wie Kasch, hat gleich mäßig gewesen. Als der Bruder und der gute Freund und wird sich rechnen, mit dem das war Achelim von anderen Umis, und jene Umis haben gleich gesagt, dass sie willen, nicht nur die Posach Horetz Lifnehem, sondern sie willen Kol Horetz.
And the sad thing is, every time that we did give back land, what did we get for it? Nothing. All that happened is that the enemy who wants to destroy us got a little bit closer and their tactics were developed. Now, again, I want to reiterate that this law has nothing to do with the land of Israel. This law would be as true in America, in Texas, in Mexico, Canada, wherever you are in the world. This law stands true because it's a value. It has nothing to do with the sanctity of the land, to the point that in the 1980s, early 1980s, when there was discussion about giving back land, Rabbi Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz, the chief rabbi of London at the time, of the United Kingdom, actually, he was pretty pro giving back different pieces of land, but he drew the line famously when it came to the old city of Jerusalem and the Kotel. Because of its sanctity, that we won't give back. The Rebbe in a letter writes back to him and says, there is nothing in Israel that is holy enough to justify the death of even one soul. And that if for the sake of security, for the sake of preserving life, there's no such thing of holiness. Our priority is preserving life. We not giving back land has nothing to do with holiness, with sanctity, with heritage. It has to do with simple security. It's tactics. You keep your people safe. You protect your people first. Everything else is secondary. Don't even start at the old city with the Kaisel. Forget about it. Nothing. Not even the border cities. And that's what the Code of Jewish Law is telling us. Okay. Any questions before we make a little summary and continue? Okay. So what we have so far, just some of the values. Your enemy rises up to kill you, you strike first. Preemptive attacks. We finish the job, we don't stop. No matter what the pressure is, you must finish the job. Defensive positions are an absolute must, and we never give away a defensive position. Unfortunately, since 1948, it seems that for the most part, again, for that one exception, the Six-Day War and the attack on the nuclear reactor, Israel has decided to wait to being struck before responding. The response is always restrained and always looking for a quick ceasefire that they agree to. And from oil fields of Sinai to Gaza, Israel has been more than ready to give back extremely strategic military positions, defensive positions, and the proof is in the pudding. And unfortunately, October 7th is just a result of all of this. Not to blame anybody, but it's to paint the picture for the otherwise. Look at the Torah values. Look at the ideas that the Rebbe was screaming about for 40 years nonstop. The Rebbe was probably, I don't know if there was another Jewish leader in history that spoke as much and wrote as much and to a certain extent cared as much as the Rebbe did about the Holy Land. For 40 years nonstop, publicly, privately, behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. The Rebbe dedicated so much of his life to it, and it meant the world to the Rebbe. You can hear the pain in his voice, the way the Rebbe spoke about it. And it's as if the Rebbe was talking today. Nothing has changed.
I think, it goes beyond that. I mean, there's the inanimate part of a war, but there is the human part of it. And I think in that one, right, that was probably the greatest mistake of it. I mean, this week we killed these two guys. with three guys, essentially, because Muhammad
Right.
also
Right.
died a couple.
Right.
And to me, they had to have known for the last 20 years where these guys were.
For sure.
Why didn't they take him out?
For sure.
Okay? When Israel attacked Lebanon, they had Arafat literally prisoner in the harbor of Beirut.
Yeah.
They could have bombed him and killed all of him and all his cronies.
Yeah.
There would not have been an intifada, there would not have been anything.
Israel knew what was going on in Gaza the past 20 years. They didn't just wake up.
These guys, Nasrallah, what you think? Nasrallah, we haven't had opportunities to knock him out, or Khamenei in Iran.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nonsense.
Yeah.
We need these guys as if we are going to negotiate with them.
Yeah.
We're going to negotiate with you.
So we're going to send them the recording after tonight, and we'll have some good talks.
So, I mean, if we don't do this.
Actually, just was it 2 weeks ago at the RNC? So Chabad had a station there, not for political reasons, just to service the Jewish community. Because
Mhm.
whether you're on
Same.
the right side or the left side, Jews need to eat kosher food. They need to pray. They need to wrap tefillin. They need Shabbos candles, and that's what we were there for. But while we were there, we decided to utilize our time, thanks to the young students who had their finger on the pulse of society. They knew who everybody that had any influence was. And there was a book in English that just came out with the Rebbe's, basically everything that we're discussing now. It was just printed in a book about 300 pages long. I forget the name of the book. I have two copies in my office if anybody wants to see. I forget the name. It was done along with Sichos in English. But either way, about the Rebbe's opinion on how to achieve peace in the land of Israel. And we went around making sure that anybody who was highly influential got a copy of the book, and hopefully that they would read it, up to, one of the candidates running for presidency down to news reporters. I think we distributed well over 40 or 50 of them. And please God, they'll read something, but we need to send them to Israel now. Though Netanyahu has a copy, it was on his coffee table. I saw him reading it, so we'll see what happens with that. Yes.
Our demonstration is that Israel has to agree to a ceasefire so that how many hostages that are still alive can come home. On the other side, we got Netanyahu and the rest of these Americans that say, no, we have to continue the war and destroy Hamas, otherwise they're not stronger than they ever were.
Right.
It seems like the people who are protesting this war and demanding a ceasefire are in violation of the
Okay. You're actually on the money with this, and this is exactly what I want to segue into now, and that is, who are the ones to make the decisions? Because the decisions seem to be pretty clear, although not always black and white. There are areas that are gray, and there are questions that have to be asked. Can we sacrifice other lives? Can't we sacrifice lives? Are we sacrificing? But the real question isn't, what is the right question to ask? The real question is, who is the one who makes a decision? So, and this is something which, as we're gonna explore now, and that goes as follows. From the Torah's perspective, when it comes to any of these decisions, the only people that should be making the decisions is very straightforward, and that is currently active security members, experts, which means military and intelligence, and using security parameters only, which means politicians should not be making the decisions and the choices, as well as those who are, if it is a general, if it is somebody in the intelligence office, any geopolitical considerations, any political considerations, period, are completely off the table. The moment you bring that in, you're dirtying the waters. You're doing something wrong. That is the wrong decision to be making. It's almost like if somebody was suffering from some kind of, life-threatening situation, and you bring them to the hospital, you don't go to the director of the hospital. You don't go to the PR director of the hospital and ask their advice. You get the best doctor in the hospital to give their advice, and you follow that. You don't start playing games with politics in the hospital when someone's life is on the line. You don't start playing games with politics when millions of lives are on the line every single day in Israel.
Look at Nancy, it must be.
Like
Are they in violence, I mean, the people that are demanding ceasefire,
people are allowed to feel and demand whatever they want. That's the truth.
what are they violating?
They're not the ones making the decision.
know
I,
they're not
I would
making
not, I would not want to put myself in the shoes of somebody whose brother, sister, mother, daughter is being held captive for 300 days. I don't know how they're feeling. I don't know what they would feel. I can't even think about it. For them to feel one way or another is 100% correct. There's nothing, not violating anything. The question is, who's making the decisions for the actions being taken on the ground? That's what's relevant to you and I here today. To those who want to protest, I guess a free country and a country that believes in democracy, we allow for protests. But we shouldn't mix protesting with actions on the ground. These are two completely separate arenas. So they're not in violation of anything. Some of them have a misunderstanding and some of them have a broken heart. Or maybe they're right, who knows? The question really is, what should we be doing on the front lines?
The problem that you have is the ambiguity of the goals. Okay, so you want the experts. When you want an expert, you essentially either say, diagnose and
Exactly.
fix, or conversely, this is what I want you to fix. I want you to replace my knee. Okay,
Right.
so now that's the only thing I want you to worry about, replacing
Exactly.
my knee. Well, in this case, they said three things. One, destroy Hamas, which, it's an ideology. So how the heck do you destroy an ideology with an army? Okay, but you can say destroy all the people that follow Hamas. So now you can exterminate everybody in Gaza and you're not going to miss anybody.
Right.
Okay. Second, we want to rescue our hostages. Well, that's at that point you're allowing all these demonstrations because you said to rescue the hostages. How are you going to rescue if you're not going to negotiate with them? If you're going to kill them, then instead we could have said we will recover all the bodies, live and dead, from all our.
Then again, these are all true facts. The question is, what should be happening? Which means the priority is security and protecting lives. What they're telling civilians and how civilians are responding, in reality, should have nothing to do with the war. And that would be a healthy situation. But yes. All right, one more question, then we're going to move a little forward.
I look back into and I see the reaction of Yaakov Avinu to what his sons did to his families. Here you have their daughter who had been taken, their sister, I should say, raped, and they knew that if they would succumb to Shemites' plan was, it would be the end of the family, the end of the nation. So what was Yaakov's actual reaction? Here was the person who could make a decision about what to do. The sons are ready to annihilate the Shemites, and he took everything that they, was Yaakov's reaction like the reaction that we have in Israel, or what do you think of us?
Right. It's a very good question, but that's an analysis of another story. When it either comes closer to that parsha or maybe later tonight, we can sit and analyze it, but we're going to leave it off the side for now, okay? Let's hold the questions. Okay, just for now, let's advance a little bit and then we'll see what happens next. All right. Now, the question now is, so what do we do with the fact that the international community is putting a lot of pressure on Israel? And it always does. The UN's favorite punching bag is Israel. And there's this pressure that's going to come nonstop. So what do we do then? How do we respond to that? So once again, we have clear guidance from the Torah that will prove valuable in how to respond to these different pressures coming from different places. Now, the reasons for these pressures, who knows what they are, whether it's veiled anti-Semitism or just because they feel like they can get away with it for whatever reason, that Israel will always yield to the pressure. But how do we really navigate these ideas? So, number one, let's just recap the rules that will give us the guidance. The land of Israel is ours because God said so. It has nothing to do with the UN declaration, it has nothing to do with Balfour. Based on that, the way we are going to run this country is protect our citizens with absolute security and safety. And that is preemptive attacks to eliminate any and all security threats. We don't stop a military operation in middle for the sake of a ceasefire. We finish the job, and we never cede any control over strategic defensive positions. And what happens when, God forbid, we don't follow any of the above mentioned, and we do compromise, well, what happens to pressure? Pressure, the more you allow it to fester, the more it builds, and the more it builds eventually just crushes you. And that's unfortunately what has happened throughout the history. Let's take a look at the way the Rebbe puts it.
3-4 Mal noch anan, bei dem Maime du Matze, was gewinnt, Kimat Punkt, a Kopie von dem Maime du Matze wisst. Allemal ist das Schinui in Welt in der Tor, hier öfter Samtzen bei der Jod. Es muss ein Schinui. Denn der Kudas, wo Pnimis, wird tegen Ihnen derselbe Maime du Matze, dieselbe Menschen, was davon durchführen, die Schliche, dieselbe Menschen oder Seele, Talmiden, was einem Afria, und dieselbe Teines. Das ist der Weg zu Scholem, und das ist der Weg zu Tzaddik V'Yeshe, und das wird mit Hom Hashem Meisen Baum Israel, und es darf sich rechnen nicht, hey, Namla, wo der Dischke. Man muss ankommen zu Israel und
So with pressure, we completely stand up to pressure from the first moment it's there, and all of a sudden the pressure disappears. The longer we let it sit, the more we open up conversations to it, the more the pressure builds up and the rivers flow. Now, something interesting, and that is, when it comes to Israel and the United States, I think we can all agree that the United States has been an extremely close ally of Israel for the most part, and still are. However, there's a little bit of a problem here, and that is, you see, America supplies for us financial aid, military aid, political support, and many times it uses its UN Security Council veto power against resolutions condemning Israel, thankfully to the defense of Israel. However, on the flip side, and we reap all the benefits of this beautiful relationship, but on the flip side, there's always pressure coming from America, and that is pressure to make peace, cede land, ceasefire, practice restraints. And it becomes very difficult of what to do. So now you're going to say, but one second, don't we have the value? We do everything for the sake of security and saving lives. And that's true. And that's why we said before, if we're ever, posed with a question of, do we go with security and strength or compromise, we always should be following security and strength. So it seems like a no-brainer. However, a lot of the times, the question comes from, do we follow our powerful position with security and strength? Or do we listen to the Americans with their promise and commitments for security, which is, of course, we'll support you if anybody does anything. And of course, we'll have your back. And of course, we'll be the first ones to come to your defense. Just stop fighting now. So all of a sudden here, the question becomes a little bit more gray, that we're basically compromising security for the sake of a security commitment powers the world. What do we do then? Seems a little bit more complex. But there's something important to understand here, and that is as follows. There's nothing wrong with, or no shame in saying this, and that is, the President of the United States of America is tasked with protecting the United States and its perceived interests. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And there shouldn't be anything more, shouldn't be anything less. That's the definition of the President of the United States of America. The President of the United States of America should not be looking out for the best interests of people of another country over their own country. And based on that, it's pretty foolish to assume that the US has Israel's best interest or truest best interest in mind. And that there's nothing wrong with that. It's the fact that America needs to look out for itself, and Israel has other priorities. And that's just a reality of two countries being on two different parts of the world fighting two different wars. So that's number one. And based on that, we have to realize that America doesn't always have Israel's best interest in mind. But again, it's not evil, it's not malicious, and on the contrary, it should be expected. To expect otherwise would be ridiculous. But there's another component here, and that is the US doesn't consistently honor By the way, just want to note on that first idea. That's why the Rebbe did encourage Israel to diversify their military supply lines, saying keep in touch with the Russians because America many times was threatened by not giving weapons. And the Rebbe says you need another supply line. Or when it came to getting oil from Norway, and there were different times throughout the history, and right, one of the more famous ones that was in the 80s. The Rebbe strongly encouraged Israel not to listen to America. America was putting a lot of pressure on Israel. And America made Israel close down their Lavi plane program in order to receive planes from America. What Israel did was they lost the opportunity of developing their own fighter jet. They became reliant on America for their fighter jet, which means that they had to listen to the Americans when they wanted their jets, and they couldn't even sell jets to other countries and make a few dollars off of it. So they lost on both aspects. But once again, America had its own interests, Israel had its own interests, and there's nothing wrong with that. You have to realize that and recognize that and respect that. But then we have the second issue, and that is America doesn't always consistently honor its foreign policy guarantees. Now, it might sound shocking to some, or doesn't look like anybody's shocked by that, but all right. But it happened many times. And I want to give two examples of this phenomenon when it did take place. And one is, following the 1956 Sinai War, so to convince Israel to retreat from Sinai and Gaza, the US government guaranteed that they would treat the future blockade of the Straits of Tiran down at the bottom, which is really what the whole Suez Canal War was about. And they said that if anybody blocks it, America said, we will treat that as an act of war. Because Israel is claiming the moment we give away the Sinai, the moment we give away Gaza, complete access, we don't control it anymore. And they can now block our ships from coming in and out. So America said, don't worry, we got your back. If you give back the land, you retreat out of Sinai, we will consider this an act of war. Guess what happens? In 1967, comes along Egypt, and they close the canal. What did America do? Absolutely nothing. But guess what? Not only did they say not do anything, they told Israel, don't start a war. Don't fight back. What did Israel do? Not listen. And they were victorious in that one. But once again, so we see that they didn't stand behind their own words. In 1994, a second example of this was in the Budapest Memorandum. And there was an agreement that Ukraine would give up all their nuclear weapons in its territory. And at that point, Ukraine was the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. What would be the exchange? All right. The exchange was Russia's agreement to never threaten its territorial integrity. Who was the signatory on that? The United States. The rest is history. We're living through it. We're witnessing what's going on, okay? So once again, now this should not come as a surprise for a few reasons. First of all, presidents and policies change. Just because there's a current president sitting in the White House who makes a policy putting pressure, you don't need to listen to that. 4 years later, there's going to be a different president who knows what the policy is going to be like. How do you know that 4 years from now, this is going to make a difference? You have to make your decision based on what your country needs right now, what Israel needs right now, not to give in to pressure from America. What's the big deal there? That's number one. Number two, priorities change. For America right now, this might be a priority. In 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 16 years from now, however long from now it is, it's going to be a completely different story. And if that's the case, why even entertain that pressure? And there's something else that the Rebbe pointed out, and that is, in regards to the relationship between America and Israel, the Rebbe pointed out, the United States, their greatest interest is to have an ally in the Middle East. But they don't want a pushover. They want a strong ally. In the words of the Rebbe, says they don't want a good boy who's just going to listen to whatever they're told and somebody who's docile. They want a strong ally, not a needy ally in the Middle East. And the greatest proof is, as we said before, what was the greatest decisive history in modern state of Israel? The 6-Day War. What was America's opinion on the 6-Day War? Not a fan, period. But America had no ties with Israel, essentially, before the 6-Day War. America did not start trading arms with Israel until 1972. Was the first time that the weapon system arrived in Israel from America. What happened? America saw a strong ally in the Middle East, and America said, wait, we want to be allies with them. They're strong, they're decisive, they know what they're doing.
weapons, Russian weapon systems, Soviet weapon systems that Israel took from the Suez Canal and gave it so they could fight in Vietnam.
Yeah,
So that was a tit for tat.
but you're talking about Vietnam. That's exactly why America didn't want to get involved in 1967 with what was going on in Israel, because they realized we're fighting our own war. We got to go mix in with another war, which just strengthens the idea. You have to realize every country and every president has what their priorities are at the time, and therefore there's no reason to give it to pressures just because of the relationship. It will not sour, it will not ruin the relationship. On the contrary, the Rebbe's idea was that it's going to strengthen the relationship. When they see a strong partner, they're going to want to partner even more, not less. And the second is that what ends up happening is, unfortunately, because of the strong partnership that we had with America, so it's kind of blinded Israel to a certain extent and kind of held their hands behind their back due to other issues. So that's number one. Number two, for the most part, America sitting where it is would just rather less wars, less problems. They're not necessarily sitting there of who should be victorious, who shouldn't. The land of Israel, the people of Israel know that Israel has to be victorious. America's not necessarily looking at it from that perspective. To America, the quicker the problem goes away, the better. And therefore, whatever the quickest resolution is going to be, that's what we're going to do. So what is it? Let's look for the weakest link every time a problem comes up. You press the weakest link, and if it folds, the problem goes away, at least for the time being. All Israel has to do is stand up, and if the pressure won't crush the weakest link, America will have to find the next weakest link to bring about the quickest resolution to the crisis. And this is how it has worked historically. Let's take a look at really what happened was what led to many of the, really America putting a lot of pressure on Israel was it started off with simple conversations at the Madrid conference in 1991 with Yitzhak Shamir, where at that point he was strong about we're not giving back anything. And all it took was a little pressure from America. He gave in to say, okay, let's just talk about it. Long story short, fast forward a few years, this leads to giving back everything. And once again, that was necessary was standing up against that pressure. And during the times where Israel did stand up, it didn't weaken the relationship. It actually strengthened it. I'll give you a few examples of this. Israel's nuclear program, which we're going to discuss in a moment, was something which America did not agree with. Nowadays, America couldn't be happier with it. Israel's preemptive strike that started the Six-Day War, the 1981 annexation of the Golan Heights, 1981 attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the assassination of many Iranian scientists. And America said nothing. America first said no. Once Israel stood up and said, we're not giving into the pressure, America appreciated more than they didn't. But that didn't mean that they didn't threaten them. There were times where America threatened Israel, in times of Shamir, that they wouldn't give them the $11 billion loan that they needed for weapons. But nevertheless, they should not have given in. Let's take a look at the way the Rebbe puts it.
Weiß jeder Mensch, was kennt a Tewe von einem Menschen, aber schaß der Tewe der Nitwa wird schwacher, wird der Tewe starker. Und man will haben Achschiva Tfisa Smoke, und man will, man soll sich rechnen, bei Israel mit Eretz Yisrael, darf Eretz Yisrael sein stark in der Starkheit, mit welcher sie verstehen und rechnen, mit sie. Beschaß man Tag gegeben, die Nacht, hat man bewiesen die größte Schwachkeit durch Abnehmen dem Zoi betochen Achi Chashuvim und Achi Ikrim, auch geben dort dem Zatsche Knegel, wo das hat gleich bewiesen, mit wem man handelt. Und wir kommen bei sie Monen als Mehrer und man hat es auch sehr getan, weil derich sehen alle wie Turim, was man gemacht noch drauf. Ist nicht der Pirush, aber das nennt gemacht dem Scholim, jeder Vitur hat gemacht schwacher, dem Zad, was hat mit Water gewählt.
And what's actually interesting, the Rebbe was once quoted for saying that after the Sinai War in 1956, and Israel giving back Sinai because of pressure from America, that there were American diplomats that went over to the Israelis and said, why did you listen? So he said, what do you mean? You guys threatened us with $11 billion. He says, you shouldn't have listened, and we would have been fine with it either way. We didn't want you to listen. We had to threaten you, and you were supposed to not listen. It's like right? It's like the classic
It
story.
wasn't just that, you had the British and the French too.
True,
That's,
true.
that's where.
But where the pressure was coming from, they should have stood up. And even the politicians themselves that were threatening didn't even mean the threats.
Even go so far, I mean, the Leviathan and the Karish fields in the Mediterranean, I mean, we just gave half of it to Lebanon.
Yeah.
We didn't have to do anything. It was all ours.
Yeah.
It's in international waters and it's our discovery, so.
Yeah. Now, one more point in regards to this, this diplomacy and the allies, or the allied agreement with the U.S., and that is whenever Israel makes an irreversible change, whenever they draw the line in the sand and they say, we don't care because we need this for survival, America has always come around to it. And the most classic idea of this is Israel's nuclear program. America told them not to start. America told them they're not allowed to start. America threatened them, along with every other country in the world threatening Israel. What did Israel say? No, we're doing it. And Israel has two policies. Number one, we're going to do it. Number two, any of our enemies that is developing anything, we will not allow for this. This is a direct threat to our existence. We draw the line in the sand here. And nowadays, nobody says anything. It's a reality. Israel is not even part of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and hasn't accepted the International Atomic Energy Agency with safeguards, because Israel says, we're not playing on your terms and we're not playing with your rules. We're playing with our rules, because if we don't, it means the destruction of every single individual in Israel. It means another Holocaust in Israel. And because of that, we're drawing the line in the sand. Had they done this with other issues, America and other countries that applied pressure would have come around to it. They would have had no choice. But all of a sudden, everything's negotiable. And the moment it becomes negotiable, as we said, then the pressure just caves in. One area that the Rebbe Israel to implement was populating those areas that we call strategically important, known as Judea and Samaria, with armed civilian settlements. And that doing so would, be having the armed population would serve as a buffer that blocks enemies from going deep into the land and being able to penetrate Israel in the way that they have. Okay. Now, here's the real question. This is very nice that we're all sitting here discussing this, but I don't think that any of us are going to go out tomorrow and sign any declarations. None of us are going out tomorrow going to be able to sway the politicians that be unfortunate who are still making decisions, even though it shouldn't be the politicians, whether it be American or Israeli politicians or anybody in between. What is the point of all this? So firstly, it was a nice academic exercise and spending time at all. But secondly, it really shows us how to think. It shows us where to come from. But it's something even more than that, and that is, even though for the most part, the Israeli government and the different dignitaries and the different political players and even the military players who spoke to the Rebbe and would discuss for countless hours strategies, secrets, and different things that were going on in the Israeli government and in the military. But there is something else interesting. So even though most of the time they didn't even listen to the Rebbe, but as you see in hindsight, everything's 2020. But there's something else that the Rebbe always brought up with them. And many of them questioned, why would the Rebbe even discuss this? And that was something beyond politics and military policy. Let's take a look. This is a meeting in 1972 with Yitzhak Rabin and the Rebbe.
In the United States,
that this one? Here.
I remember quite vividly this discussion. It started by a question that was put to me by the rabbi. Aren't you feel alone as the representative of the Jewish state among 120 countries and peoples that are represented in Washington? From this beginning, the rabbi started to deal with the question, Am levadad ishkon, what has kept the people of Israel always, little bit alone, by choice or by outside pressure or rejection. it's by the two forces. First, by our own choice, by the Jewish people's own choice, to be what they are, to stick to the Torah, to the faith, to the tradition of the Jewish people for 2,000 years, without a state, Inquisition, expulsion, pogroms, no doubt the Holocaust. And regardless to all this, the Jewish people remain faithful to the Jewish religion, to the Jewish tradition, and succeeded to survive what no people anywhere in the world proved to be successful.
Ever since October 7th, there's been a widespread sense of loneliness and fear in the Jewish world, and that is, maybe the world will never accept us to be a part of its society and will remain eternal victims of history. Comes along the Rebbe in this discussion, quoting the verse, right? What does Bilam say? Behold, it is a people that dwells alone and is not reckoned among the other nations. Now, is this a blessing? Is this a compliment? Or is this a curse? It's actually interesting. The way the verse itself starts off is, for this nation's beginning, I see them as established and powerful, like mountains and hills. Behold, it is a nation that dwells alone. And it's important to recognize that. And that is, Bilam was not giving us a curse. He was actually giving us the greatest blessing. And that is, we don't need to rely on everybody else to give us our strength. We don't need to rely on everybody else to give us our pride. We have to recognize it is God who gives us our strength. It is these values, our identity, our strength, and our pride that ultimately will give us any of that. No one else is going to give it to us. And therefore, it must come from within. As the Rebbe wrote in a letter in 1973 to Rabin, the psychological factor has such an important role when two adversaries confront each other. When the adversary sees that his opponent is spiritually and psychologically strong and self-confident and certain of his just cause and not prone to be impressed by the adversary or any non-Jew due to the inferiority complex mentioned above, this is the best way of preventing wars. Not only major wars, but even wars of attrition. And that is to the Rebbe. All of the military advice and strategies that he gave the members of the IDF and the intelligence, it wasn't that he was there to give them advice. It all stemmed from this idea of where is your pride? What are your values? Own your Judaism, own your identity. We are a nation that dwells alone. That is who we are, and that is our blessing. That is the greatest gift that we've been given. And when you can take that and you can live with that and you're proud of that, that's how we're going to be victorious. And then the Rebbe says, let me tell you, and these are our values. And that's everything else that we discussed tonight.
Es kommt zu gehen, a Goy in Erzisot, gesagt, kommen dich zurück in Washington. Als gewähnt der meisten Mal in Erzisrol, mit dem bewiesen Weizmanns Institut, mit dem bewiesen die Universität, mit dem bewiesen die große Hotellen und mit dem bewiesen die große Gassen und Chulu, ist gekommen in ganzen ohne kein Eindruck. Und das der übrige eine von der Jeschwe Reich, von den Komiteeten wie jedes Archig, Deles in Kongress und im Senat, und hat übergegeben seinen Eindruck. Danach ist gefahren nach zweiten Mal, hat einen bewiesen Meir Shiori, mit dem bewiesenen Kessel Marovi, nie dem Kessel Marovi, wie ist zugeputzt. Da dem Kessel Marovi, wie sie stehen, Iden und Davnen und auch geteilt mit einer Chize von einer Seite Frauen, von der zweiten Seite Männer. Nie die Aniem und die Bettler, was sie seinen Mewalbel zu der Tfile und betten sie doch. Danach hat man noch herangeführt in ein Stiebel und in eine Yeshiva mit zerbrochenen Bänken und Chulu, ist gekommen zu fahren, danach in Washington gesagt, ich hat gesehen, der Holy Land. Und danach hat Messiah gewählt, man soll geben ein Phantom.
So let's bring this idea home, and we'll conclude with that. And that is, number one, as the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks said, the world respects Jews who respect themselves. when we're able to stand up for our values, when we're able to stand up for identity with pride and with belief, the world follows along with that. The moment we doubt it, the moment we question it, they smell the fear, they smell the blood, and they pounce on it. That's number one. Number two, so what do we do with that here? We're sitting across the world. We're not the ones standing in Israel fighting this war, but the war is so much bigger than that. In addition to the physical war being fought, it's an ideological war being fought around the world. And therefore, each and every one of us, with our beliefs that we have, with the pride that we have, with what we give our children, what we give the next generation, and the way that we respond by acting with prayer, with charity, with doing another good deed, doing another mitzvah. And when we do that collectively, we're able to bring peace to the world. May we merit to see peace in our time, and we merit the ultimate peace, which is the coming of Mashiach. Now, thank you for joining us tonight.